Roman religion did not reflect the soul of the people. It reflected the architecture of their power. Mommsen begins with a stark observation. Religion in early Rome was not a matter of conscience, not a search for the divine, and certainly not a doctrine of salvation. It was a civic function, modeled after the political structure of the Roman state itself. The divine world was arranged with the same sense of precision and hierarchy as the human. Every segment of Roman life, every class, action, and space, was mirrored by a corresponding divine entity. But these were not grand, universal gods. They were specific, function-bound figures. The Roman pantheon was populated by tutelary spirits, whose duties were as narrowly defined as a magistrate's. Some governed plowing, others childbirth, others the hinges of a door or the boundary of a field. Many had no myth, no image, and no name beyond the role they served. Mommsen stresses that these gods were often temporary in scope, called into being for a particular act, and dismissed once that act was complete. This was not religion rooted in revelation or spiritual wonder. It was ritual governance, a divine administration running parallel to the political one. The Roman state, with its layers of office, its sequence of rites, its obsession with formality, found in this religious structure not just a reflection, but a reinforcement. The gods operated according to laws. Rituals had to be performed correctly, or they were null. Omissions, mispronunciations, or errors invalidated the entire rite. The divine realm was bound by procedure, not passion. In this way, Roman religion upheld the same values as Roman governance: discipline, order, and continuity. It legitimized the state not by moral teaching or mythic origin, but by function. The gods, like the consuls and censors, existed to keep the machine of Rome running, no more, no less. This was belief without speculation, worship without ecstasy. A religious system not designed to transcend the state, but to stabilize it. Conquest in Rome extended beyond walls and weapons. It reached the heavens. Mommsen details a distinctive feature of Roman religious policy: the systematic absorption of foreign deities. When Rome subdued a city, it often performed a ritual of evocatio, a formal invitation for the enemy's gods to abandon their native shrines and take up residence in Rome. This was not merely a symbolic act. It was a theological strategy built into the machinery of expansion. The Romans did not destroy foreign cults. They appropriated them. They offered new temples, new rituals, and new places in the Roman pantheon. The conquered deity, now a guest of the Roman state, was expected to return the favor through loyalty and divine favor in battle. This act had legal force. Evocatio was recorded, witnessed, and fulfilled through sacred pledges, binding the state and the divine in a political contract. It neutralized the spiritual resistance of the enemy and strengthened Rome's own religious arsenal. Mommsen interprets this not as theological curiosity, but as ritualized pragmatism. Rome expanded its religious system the same way it expanded its institutions, by absorbing what worked and subordinating it to Roman order. The gods of the Etruscans, Latins, Sabines, and later Greeks were not rejected. They were conscripted. But integration did not mean equality. The new gods were assigned roles, subordinated within the Roman hierarchy, and controlled by the state priesthoods. Their cults could be practiced, but only through officially sanctioned forms. Worship was domesticated, made safe, predictable, and Roman. In this, Mommsen sees a defining trait of Roman religion: its capacity to domesticate the divine without submitting to it. The gods served the city, not the other way around. To conquer a people was to conquer their heavens. And Rome, with characteristic precision, had a ritual for that too. Before the myths of Olympus reached the Tiber, Rome had gods of its own, formless, voiceless, but not absent. Mommsen reconstructs the earliest Roman religious landscape through the fragments preserved in Rome's oldest sacred calendar, the Fyrii Publici. What emerges is a pantheon unlike that of Homer or Hesiod, a divine system not built on drama, genealogy, or anthropomorphism, but on function, ritual, and civic need. The original Roman divine triad was not Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, as later Hellenized tradition would assert, but Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. Each reflected a foundational pillar of Roman identity. Jupiter was the sovereign sky god, presiding over oaths, treaties, and the sanctity of the state. He was not a father of gods in the Greek sense, but a divine magistrate, called upon to guarantee order and enforce loyalty. Mars, in this early configuration, was not simply a war god. He was also a guardian of agriculture, protecting the boundaries of the land and the labor that sustained it. His dual role reveals a Rome that saw no contradiction between the sword and the plow. They were tools of survival. Quirinus, the most enigmatic of the triad, was likely a deified Romulus, symbolizing the political body of the Roman citizenry, the rites. He stood for the people in their civil form, not their martial one. This triad, Mommsen notes, reflects the structure of early Rome itself: religious sovereignty, military power, and civil unity. It was a pantheon tailored not to narrative, but to governance. There were no origin stories, no divine rivalries, no cosmologies. There was only form and function. Other deities in this early phase were similarly abstract. Janus, the god of beginnings; Vesta, the hearth; Terminus, the boundary marker. They had no bodies, no myths, no theatrical cults, only rituals and offices. Rome's religion, in this phase, was neither poetic nor philosophical. It was institutional, a pantheon not imagined for beauty, but assembled for utility. And for centuries, it served its purpose, until Greece arrived with its heroes, its passions, and its epics. But beneath the myths, that older triad remained: the ritual bones of Rome's original theology of the state. Roman religion demanded correctness, not conviction. In early Rome, piety was measured not by belief, but by execution. Mommsen stresses that religion was a system of procedures, where the efficacy of a ritual depended entirely on its precise performance. There was no room for spontaneity, no tolerance for improvisation. A prayer offered with the wrong word, a sacrifice made at the wrong moment, invalidated the act. The gods responded not to faith, but to form. This formalism shaped every aspect of public worship. Rites had to follow fixed sequences. Gestures, invocations, and offerings were all prescribed in exhaustive detail. The outcome of a ritual depended on whether the state had fulfilled its obligations with absolute precision. If the formula failed, the fault lay not in doctrine but in ritual error, a flaw to be corrected, not questioned. Mommsen makes clear that this rigidity was not superstition, it was control. Religion, like law, served to impose order through repetition. The priests were not spiritual guides, they were technicians of the sacred. Their role was not to interpret divine will, but to ensure that every line, every motion, every word conformed to precedent. Even prayer, in Rome, was legalistic. It listed the gods by name and office, often including formulaic disclaimers to cover omissions, or by whatever name or title you prefer to be called. It was the language of a contract, not a cry of the soul. This ritualism permeated civic life. The founding of cities, declarations of war, election of magistrates, all were tied to auguries and sacrifices. Nothing official occurred without divine sanction, and divine sanction required ritual purity. Mommsen's point is sharp. Roman religion did not inspire ecstasy or philosophical speculation. It stabilized the state, embedding divine expectation into public conduct. Worship was not an act of personal devotion. It was a duty, exacted with the same gravity as a legal oath. In this, religion and governance were indistinguishable. Both rested on precedent. Both feared deviation. And both relied on the Roman obsession with procedure as power. Religious authority in Rome was never left to mystics. It belonged to institutions. Mommsen explains that the religious life of the Republic was controlled not by prophets or visionaries, but by a series of priestly colleges, each with strictly defined responsibilities and deep integration into the machinery of state. These were not marginal clerics. They were political actors, legal authorities, and gatekeepers of public legitimacy. At the center stood the pontifices, led by the Pontifex Maximus. They maintained the calendar, oversaw sacrificial law, regulated family rights, and ensured that religious obligations were properly fulfilled. In essence, they functioned as archivists of divine order. Their decisions shaped when laws could be passed, when wars could begin, and when elections could be held. Beside them were the augurs, who interpreted the will of the gods through signs, especially the flight of birds. No public act was legitimate without their sanction. If the omens were wrong, even a duly elected magistrate could be voided. In this way, augury became a constitutional check, exercised under the guise of divine interpretation. The Officiales managed Rome's ritual diplomacy. Before war could be declared, they were required to make formal appeals and perform ancient rites of justification. Their task was not to prevent war, but to ensure that it was waged under divine law. Then came the Flamens, priests of specific gods, Jupiter, Mars, Quirinus, each bound by elaborate restrictions and public duties. Their conduct was regulated to the minutest detail, where they could sleep, what they could wear, what actions they could perform. Their lives were a visible enactment of sacred discipline. These colleges were not open to interpretation. They were oligarchic in structure and dominated by patricians. Control over ritual meant control over the calendar, over civic legitimacy, over war and peace. Mommsen emphasizes that this was no mere spiritual bureaucracy. It was a political engine shrouded in religious form. To govern Rome was to govern its rituals. And in Rome, power came not just from laws or arms, but from the ability to declare, with authority, when the gods permitted action. Roman religion had gods, but no theology. Mommsen draws attention to a remarkable absence at the heart of early Roman belief. There was no speculation about the nature of the divine. No metaphysics, no cosmogony, no ethical system handed down by divine law. The Romans did not ask who the gods were, or where they came from. They asked only what the gods required. Worship in Rome was not a relationship, it was a transaction. The state performed the correct rites, and in return, the gods maintained the stability of the world. The Roman formula was simple: deute da, I give so that you may give. Faith was measured not in internal conviction, but in external precision. Piety was procedural, not emotional. This lack of theological depth did not imply irreligion. On the contrary, Mommsen stresses that the Romans were deeply reverent of form. But their reverence was administrative. The gods were not moral teachers or philosophical archetypes. They had no dogma to transmit, no sacred texts to explain, no priestly doctrine to impose. What emerged was a system where divine presence was assumed, but never questioned. The gods were real because their rites worked. Harvests came, enemies fell, contracts held. That was enough. There was no desire to peer beyond the veil, no impulse to debate the divine essence. Religion existed to serve the public good, not the speculative mind. Mommsen sees in this restraint a kind of genius. It prevented religious fanaticism. It avoided doctrinal schism. The system was immune to the turbulence of sects and heresies that plagued other cultures. Roman religion did not need to define truth. It needed only to protect continuity. Even as Greek myths and later philosophies entered Roman culture, the early religious structure remained untouched by theology. The Roman gods were useful, limited, and orderly. They kept no secrets because none were sought. It was religion stripped to its civic essence, not what is believed, but what is done, and done correctly. The Roman gods did not remain untouched. Greece arrived, and with it, mythology, personality, and philosophy. Mommsen notes that although the core of Roman religion was indigenous, austere, and ritualistic, over time it was profoundly transformed by Hellenic influence. The process was gradual and layered. It did not erase the Roman system. It overlaid it with names, stories, and divine anthropomorphism that had no place in the original cult. The shift began with contact. As Rome expanded into southern Italy, absorbing the Greek cities of Magna Graecia, it inherited more than territory. It inherited gods with biographies: Zeus, Hera, Athena, whose Roman counterparts had once been mere functions. Jupiter was now Zeus. Mars took on traits of Ares. Minerva absorbed Athena's wisdom and warcraft. But this was not simple substitution. The Roman state retained its structure. The rites did not change. What changed was the language of worship. The gods were now narrated. Myths circulated, statues were carved in Greek form, and temples bore the iconography of Olympus. Mommsen is careful to note that this shift introduced not just art, but thought. Greek philosophy, especially Stoicism, began to seep into Roman religious discourse. Deities became symbols of reason, nature, order. The rigid legalism of early Roman religion softened under the weight of metaphor and abstraction. Still, the Roman impulse for control remained. Even as they adopted Greek forms, the Romans did not surrender to Hellenic looseness. The gods could have stories, but they would serve the civic order, not undermine it. Myth was absorbed into ritual, but ritual kept its priority. Mommsen does not mourn this transformation. He treats it as inevitable. Rome, ever pragmatic, accepted what was useful. Greek religion offered visual grandeur, narrative richness, and cultural prestige. Rome took it and recast it in Latin. The old gods of form and function were still there, beneath the marble and myth. But now, they spoke with Greek voices. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.